Hello everyone, today we talk about Achaemenid Marines, mostly basing ourselves on Xerxes' invasion of Greece, but also on, say, sources, iconography, mostly dating to different times, because of course not much really changed in the essentials of, say, Persian marine units throughout this time, also considering, as you know, that the Achaemenids tendentially were not too interested in a maritime dimension. They controlled Phoenicia, that had been having the best sailors in the world, and that, however, was not particularly warlike for other reasons. We will see it now, because it's even difficult to characterize the typical Phoenician marine at that point, given that, of course, there was, even in this sense, not a huge difference across the Mediterranean in terms of naval warfare in general, from tactics to armament, etc. Also, it's not the first time we talk about Marines. We talk about the Milites Classiari, right, of the Roman army. That is a video that not just illustrates that specific unit arms and armor, but that observes how there wasn't fundamentally a difference between land and marine units. Right, what we look at is essentially the same type of troopers, perhaps equipped in a slightly different way for, say, fitting better naval combat, but in the essentials, right, these battles were essentially fought with boarding, right, and what happened on these ships' decks was fundamentally just of course, a different type of fighting from land, but mostly as far as, say, units tactics by scale was, an interaction with the other units was entailed, not much the individual say offensive and defensive gear, right, reason for which there is an abundance of material on which to base our sort of theoretical, but theoretical doesn't mean abstract, just to be specific in scientific terms, picture, say, stereotype, right, of a typical. Today we'll see Phoenician, Egyptian, and Lycian marine that participated, most in fact, famously to the second, so-called Second Persian War, and that in general made up a consistent part, if not the majority even, of Achaemenid maritime forces whenever they were needed. Of course, we will look briefly at, but also the political and social background of Phoenicia, Egypt, and Lycia, to get better why, certain troops were, for example, more or less prized and praised in the process. And we start from the Phoenicians, about which, as I was hinting at before, we don't have an overwhelming amount of information, especially as far as arms and armor is concerned, right? The Achaemenids called essentially Mediterranean, say Syria, can say, and everything laying also south through Phoenicia and Palestine, as the province across the river, meaning the Euphrates. So, as we were saying before, the Persians had their, say, core lands, in fact, in the Iranian plateau, in Mesopotamia, and, of course, while reaching as far as the Scythian steppes and the Nubian. I made a video about the Nubian infantry, the Nubian troops in general, in the Achaemenid armies, for not talking about, the reaches of the east, right? A terrestrial background, right? The average Achaemenid trooper was fundamentally a shepherd, mountaineer, a farmer, right, from the Mashrek, broadly meant, and as such, he would have not known particularly much about naval warfare. First place, it was a lot of river warfare across, this immense land that the Achaemenids control. But the point being that the Persians fundamentally needed other people, especially as far as an invasion of Greece in the westernmost part of the empire, right? Pretty far away land. Remember Mardonius' speech, right, to Xerxes, etc., to say your main enemies will be land and sea rather than the Greeks per se. So it was also important to get the best. And of course the Phoenicians, as we know, had plenty of naval experience. It would constitute the backbone of the Persian navy at this point. We're talking Phoenicia, but also Palestine, that provided ships to Xerxes in 480, right? The Phoenician fleets would continue to be definitely the mainstay of the Persian army down the line, right, until the war with Alexander, and that's just a region which will keep producing such important maritime potential, to say the least. Except this broader area of Levant, we can say Mediterranean, was not regarded by the Achaemenids otherwise as a great source of military manpower. Right, they could provide with important naval forces, but not large amount of local troops for reasons we will explain now. So much so that we know little of the local armies, right? Especially talking about Phoenicia, but generally speaking, the city-states of Levant, we know there was a citizenry body, some sort. Citizen, say, is a big word, but it still speaks a bit think about Carthage, right? Given the Phoenician parallelism, you have a very powerful oligarchy that owns the estates around the city. You have lots of other people that can eventually work for them in their clientele, are not technically citizens, and do not have the same power and just political institutional role. And there is a will, just like in Carthage, fundamentally to even prevent the local population to be armed, right? Because this could present problems in terms of coups and so on. And again, for a very oligarchic system, that's an important concern. Plus, you don't really have a Phoenician empire, right? These guys really expand by sea. There is a some sort of similarity even with the Greeks to some degree, except for the fact that the Greeks, as Europeans, were more sort of demographically expansive, right? You can see it across the Mediterranean. Phoenicians create emporia fundamentally. This is true also for Carthage, whereas the Greeks also sent an important amount of population to literally create another polis connected to the motherland, but eventually emancipating to some degree. And so this difference is particularly relevant when you understand why didn't the Phoenicians even fight as hoplites, for example. And I made a lot of content at least explaining why, of course, what we call the classical, the Hellenic politic violence is something unique, right? And sort of mostly based on Athens and Sparta rather than even the rest of Hellas, right? Which is another thing from simply saying, well, okay, I will equip myself and go at war with Hellenic arms and armor, which doesn't have to do with hoplitic fighting, actually. And this is likely the case, the filler for the Phoenician gap here, because still aside that, of course, the Phoenicians were further, say, not fully demilitarized, but at the land at least were subjected to the Persians, so they were sort of subjects that were given up as political and territorial expansion on their own, but they were strong at sea, right? And so that's mostly what the Persians used them for, right? We know that the Phoenician citizenry provided also the marines for Xerxes' fleet, And this is kind of obvious because the oligarchic families that were engaged in sea trade were in fact the same ones ruling the city with their own armed retinues, and so these would effectively be boarded on the ships and habituated to fight. It's just like the Greeks, right? You have the same hoplites on land mounting on ships and fighting again on decks with the same equipment, right? We will see this in some greater depth because yes, there were certain differences again in say between marine fighting, let's say, and the terrestrial phalangitic one, but not much changed in terms of arms and armor concretely. We know that the Phoenician citizenry defended Tyre against Alexander's siege with weapons such as bows, slings, and catapults, which is in siege warfare the minimum until you had come to grip with the enemy that is trying to storm the walls and so on. You know what Alexander literally does? He creates a freaking peninsula connecting the city, the land. In any case, these are pretty standard weapons, right? Were the Phoenician cities to rise a substantial army on land, which could still happen, and they were required to, very much like in Africa, in Carthage, they would normally employ a large amount of mercenaries. For example, when King Tennis of Sidon rebelled against the Achaemenids in 351 BC, the city forces were called numerous, well-trained, and strong. This is something you find even in Carthage. I mean, if I'm not wrong about the Carthaginian army organization, yes, it was one of the old ones, but I will re-upload it with... Oh, no, I did re-upload it in September, I think, yeah. Or it was about tactics, I think that, but I have to check that out. In any case, you find it in the Carthaginian warfare playlist. And this is the case, like the Phoenician cities were pretty rich, right? So the oligarchy could equip substantial amounts of clients in case of need, right? The fact, of course, there was an important training is relevant, right? At least militias. Here you don't have anything like what the Achaemenids themselves, that contrarily to popular opinion, were developing in terms of a extraordinary collective training, right? Do not commit the foolish mistake of thinking that, say, that the Achaemenids had an inferior military than the Hellenic one, right? Because that was definitely not the case, and you can still lose a war in the process. Anyway, but, right, we're talking here about militia, right? A militia of, again, some level of cohesion, right, given the city identity, some capacity to train even on substantial numbers when needed, not professional troops, not full-time, in fact, soldiers, for which the mercenaries instead would be used, right? In fact, on the same occasion, 351, you find this multitude of mercenary. And, right, what kind of mercenaries do you think the Phoenicians would use? Well, we are in fact in 4th century BC, well, also after the Achaemenid defeat against the Greeks. There were Hellenic mercenaries, specifically 4,000 sent by Egypt under the command of Mentor of Rhodes. Right, Egypt was allied with Sidon in the rebellion against the Achaemenid. The source, by the way, is Diodorus 1641-44. And you have this pretty consistent body of 4,000 Hellenic mercenaries that were, as such, I don't know the details here because we are in the 4th century. Well, there were surely a mix of They were predominantly heavy infantry, right? But you could have sort of different, not necessarily all hoplites. I should check, but you get the point here. 4,000 is not just a few, right? They were really a consistent and likely sort of elite kind of unit compared at least to the average of the Phoenician citizenry. Doesn't matter how well equipped they were. By the way, I made a video about an old one, right, that I re-uploaded, about the Syrians, Mesopotamians, and Persians in the Seleucid army, and there I discussed the role of these militias, right? The not say scarce role even of cavalry, right? Even in Carthage, for example, there was a strong equestrian tradition, so the Phoenicians, their elites did have some inclination for horses as well. We will see that this is, generally speaking, more pronounced than what the classical world has just told us. It was about the citizenry here, even about the language that can be used, not used, in a sort of republicanistic or democratistic sense. So we do not really get much about how a Phoenician marine would have looked like in Xerxes' times. So we can think, given I made a video about the Phoenician bireme or trireme, I don't remember that, but as substantially early type of vessel, and there we said something about the type of troops and how they could, say, move on board, etc. We'll come back on naval warfare and tactics specifically. But given at that point the deep interconnection, rivalry, and thus hybrid with the Greeks, right, at sea, we can think that the Phoenician marine would actually have adopted by that point the finest panoply available. That was the one made in Hellas. So some sort of Hellenic style helmet, linen cuirass, rimless shields, at least, if you want to imagine this Phoenician marines as slightly lighter than the Hellenic hoplites. Javelins, because of course these troops again are not copies of Hellenic hoplites. They are just using some of their arms and armor that they purchased, etc., or as praise of war, etc. We know, by the way, that the Phoenician marines were aboard 300 ships in Xerxes' expedition, so we're not talking about irrelevant numbers. And again, the Phoenicians made up the bulk of the Achaemenid fleet, qualitatively speaking. So that's something you may want to take in consideration. And I can't think of any other specific characteristic. Always bearing in mind again that when a Phoenician heavy infantryman would have fought on land, right, just in the same way, again, these were the same guys who fought on ship decks as much as on the beaches, on land, in any circumstance, it would have had a sort of more open formation, combat habit, and thus adequate equipment for that compared to the Greeks. Right? Throughout the Persian wars, it's really made clear by the Hellenic sources that they could find in front of them anything, right, while fighting the Persians and with all their subjects, right. There are some passages, for example, of the Battle of Marathon, where there was a guy with a massive guy with an axe. So this is kind of things that can happen to you if you are an Hellenic hoplite fighting in the Persian wars. And so we have to imagine a discrete heterogeneity, also based on sort of personal preferences, the background of these different cultures, how they were habituated to fight, etc. The other and perhaps overlooked component of the Achaemenid naval forces, 200 ships, was Egypt, right? So there is a lot to say about the Egyptian military background. I think I made once just a video about the Ptolemaic army organization, so we'll gradually look at this in various ages and throughout the same one. The Achaemenid were a more modern military than the Egyptian one. It's likely that, in fact, on the eve of the Persian conquest, the Egyptians used some cavalry and still chariotry. In any case, we're talking about naval warfare, so that would have been a bit complicated to use. The, most relevant aspect, I would say, for this is that the Achaemenids did levy native Egyptian soldiers. And these were not merely conscripts. They were actually the descendants of at least what were still considered the hereditary warriors from these traditional castes. We come to know them historically through the Greek names, because that was the Hellenic historiography that described them, the Machimoi, famously enough, and specifically of these two cases, the Hermotybius and the Calasirias. Herodotus says that at their most numerous, which may mean before the Achaemenid conquest of Egypt, the former, essentially the Egyptian ones, numbered 160,000, while the troops, let's say the Egyptian subjects from the north, 250,000. This is of course, just a consideration based on available manpower, not necessarily the capacity to levy them. Right, in the aforementioned 351 BC rebellion that included, in fact, also Egypt, we know of 60,000 Machimoi, right? But also about this, what is that, right? Are these guys that literally took the field at some point, or we're talking just about some garrisons that took over the local settlements and resisted the Persians at Samalia? So we will see this perhaps in some more in-depth video. And of course, at this point, anything larger than, say, a single, say, an army counting 50,000 is impossible in practice, right? It could have been just a logistical miracle to that point. So, of course, if you have different armies proceeding in different columns, it is something you can have more, but you must be really a superpower like the Achaemenid one, and still with lots of issues. And again, the thing is very complicated. I made a video about Xerxes' army order of battle, where we look at that in terms of number, of composition. You also get an idea of how many troops came from these various countries. The idea is that, however, from the Hellenic sources, that these Egyptian warriors were not traditionally involved in any trade, because this was normal also for any free, here we're not talking about freemen in general, but the sense was that as a warrior, right, and so endowed with the divine power through the royal medium, you could not work, right, because free people do not work in tradition, universal tradition. Other people work for them, right? These guys would have had a purely military education of some sort, which would not have to magnify here. They were essentially peasant soldiers of some sort. They probably farmed, right, because they were granted 12 aurori, that is something about 9 acres of land, and so yes, they may have had slaves and not worked themselves, but of course they weren't even so full-time professional soldiery, right? Egypt didn't quite have that at that point. It was, say, at least in consistent numbers, and especially the ones that we listed before. But there is an idea of substantial manpower in form of, this could be a sort of militia, right? We have to be consistent about that, right? That was also what the Roman one was before the second, say, 1st century BC to some degree, even though we're talking about much less spent peoples when looking at Europe, as we were saying before. But we do know that the Achaemenids had sort of a high opinion of these Egyptian warrior castes, because the marines that we will describe now on the Egyptian ships of Xerxes' invasion force of Greece were to stay with the elite contingent under the command of Mardonius, that was Darius' nephew, and again one of the most important generals of the Achaemenid invasion. The ones that would occupy Athens, that would be later defeated at Plataea, and these Egyptians were essentially picked to remain with this important reserve, and the only troops apparently withdrawn from the same naval force for that very purpose. Meaning what? Meaning that they were reliable enough units to fight on land, right, with a essentially a quality force, and that could fight also on ships, right, as marines proper, right? So this fact is remarkable because it shows that Egypt could provide, after all, a substantially competent and as adaptable force for this kind of tasks, right? We know of Egyptian forces fighting for Artaxerxes I against Cyrus at Cunaxa, but of course this eludes the marine dimension, which we will see now, because we have an idea of what Xerxes' Egyptian marines looked like, at least as they were fighting on land in Hellas, as we have explained. First of all, they wore so-called plated or netted helmets, so these were made of some sort of hair straw rope material, right? With more interlaced strands, so relatively light equipment, right? But we do know that most of them also had cuirasses. Herodotus states that the Achaemenids had at some point adopted some cuirass types from Egypt, right? There was, for example, one a linen one dedicated by one of the last Egyptian pharaohs that was quite elaborated, and so there was an Egyptian tradition of armor that the Achaemenids, even from the top of their military experience, were interested in adopting. The helmet, we do not really know how it could have been made, but it could be made again of this sort of kilted square patterns, right? We see from some source, and looking like a sort of net, right? Interestingly enough, according to Hellenic sources, the Egyptians were the biggest spearmen, let's say, in the Achaemenid invasion force, right? Xenophon says that the Egyptians fought with great spears, right? And Herodotus that calls short the spears basically of every other contingent of Xerxes' army. Instead, uses the normal term for the Egyptian ones. They were also equipped with javelins, axes, or swords. It is possible that the Egyptians had been developing some sort of more collective training than we think, right? The idea of sort of lighter equipment, as we'll see, this is not quite the case proper, but given this bigger spears, some maybe greater capacity to keep the enemy at a distance, but not necessarily, right? Because the size of spears could also have to do with a greater individual training as well. We will come back on this specifically for the Egyptian warfare. In any case, we have to imagine that, of course, naval warfare were significantly different, and again, more individualistic at times, especially during boarding, than especially in fact for hand-to-hand combat, right? The idea that these Egyptian Marines were also some sort of heavier trooper is stressed by the fact that they used, they're described by the sources as using large wooden shields with broad rims. This type was also carried, by the way, by the Assyrian contingent Corps 6, and this has evidently to do with some shared Near Eastern sort of shield technology, and one of substantial heaviness, right, and protection from missile, right, that especially naval warfare was at times more concentrated on land on specific units at a time. For later Egyptian infantry, Xenophon mentions, quote, wooden shields reaching to the feet, right? So some sort of, again, of door, like you see, we've seen it also in Assyrian tactics, right? It's quite typical here. Sort of mobile defense from evidently, mostly missile, etc. But it should be noted that Marines would have likely had more difficulty, right, to use these larger shields. So it's likely that they had something smaller, handier. Besides, we do not really know how these shields were practically built. There is another note, that is, Egyptians are not recorded in this context as carrying bows, right? So we do not understand clearly even how combined armed tactics were supposed to work on land, at least on the basis of this information, and also on board, right? The idea would be these Egyptians were just sort of hit takers, right, with larger shields and keeping the enemy sort of at a distance with a larger spear. So we do not really know. We lack the direct evidence, of course, but more than that, even much of the context of this troops' interactions, right? The third type of marine, naturally there were others from other nationalities, but this one is also overlooked, is from Lycia, if you prefer, right? This land was populated essentially by an Indo-European population that was a mix between Cretans, Anatolians. The Lycians were known as Tremil in their own language, and they essentially ruled over modest city-states run by local princes along the southern coast of Anatolia, in part also in the interland, right? They were as such fundamentally autonomous. They had an important, say, cultural exposure to different military traditions. The Hellenic orator Isocrates states that no Achaemenid had ever controlled Lycia specifically. And these areas were pirates' nests. Often these troops engage in pretty dynamic warfare. They had a substantial Hellenic influence in arms and armor, as witnessed, for example, by the famous heroine at Trisa. There is substantial evidence of these guys' equipment, but even about that, it's mostly the elite. We realize amphibious operations were pretty common. There was a rugged interland, again, a quite active maritime warfare just off the Lycian coasts. So this all, in spite of the modesty of these people's military potential, the role as just as an overall force, and a very well adaptable and dynamic and aggressive local warfare. During most of the Persian domination, the Lycians cooperated with the Achaemenid satraps of the neighboring Lydia or Caria. There are different monuments again of Lycia showing local troops cooperating with the Achaemenids. There is an inscription of Carrhae of Xanthus celebrating his victory over the Athenian force under Meleander 430 BC, as well as his role in the Achaemenid satrap Tissaphernes' victories in Ionia. So these guys were definitely fighting with the Greeks enough to be also, as again, their elite evidently shows, right, by hoplitic arms and armor, at least, right. We know of Cariga, Prince of Xanthus, describing himself as leading the Lycian army of the satrap. And we are told specifically of Lycian marines by Herodotus, 480, wearing cuirasses, greaves, carrying bows of cornel wood. The latter is something we have seen employed by Achaemenid cavalry for javelins, by the way, unfeathered arrows and javelins, plus goatskin slung around their shoulders and caps set around with feathers of their heads, daggers, and drepana. Now the drepana, as showed in one scene of the aforementioned Aeron at Trusa, is a sort of sickle, right, which was say not a major weapon, but in the sense is a massive, it's not the simple agricultural tool, it's something larger, made to chop, right, a lot, right, cutting limbs off, etc. This reveals the dynamism of Lycian warfare, and evidently a much looser sort of formation and individualistic fight than the hoplitic phalangitic one. There was a substantial amount of mounted warfare that, of course, doesn't interest us as far as the naval one is concerned, but it's still worth observing in this case for the elite that there's a big deal, not just of Atlantic, but obviously also of Achaemenid style of equipment. Right. There is a preponderance for the Atlantic style, so much so that we think that some Hellenic allies or mercenaries are actually represented, and so not Lycian forces. We have the Karaburan necropolis too, which shows Hellenic hoplite shields, but have also clothing and weapons of distinctive local patterns, which gives us an idea of what sort of native infantry could have looked like. All right. Specifically, we see a guy unarmored but protected by the hoplitic shield, right, of Hellenic type. He's fighting with a short spear with blades at both ends, right? Carries a long dagger on a baldric. So these weapons are quite interesting because, again, they speak of all the dynamism of these local blades. leggings were worn commonly in Anatolia. Herodotus 76 tells us of Pisidian crimson leggings, right? And this is somehow similar to what we see for the Lydians here. So we can definitely appreciate the more agile type of warfare that the Lycians could have provided, especially with their lighter troops. As the heavier ones, we would imagine they're also the hoplitic and so Achaemenid influence, or even just local sort of styles, cuirass, greaves, right? But mostly Hellenic in influence. The Drapanen we have already described, ideal for boarding, right? When you had literally to chop hands, limbs, etc. against enemies that in general we may think on board were fighting with a lighter equipment on average than on land, right? Not again for the heavier, you still needed heavier troops, but say it's not because you would fear, I don't know, to fall into the water with armor and drowning, as it did happen, by the way. It's mostly about the different level of agility. It's a sort of closer picture to siege warfare, right? Where still you have the men-at-arms that fundamentally still the stormtroopers of the situations have to be that heavy, right? But if you're boarding from, and there wasn't at this time things like the, say there were, we think, planks, right, were just thrown on the enemy deck, so there was some sort of athletic and equilibristic, say, feat to pull off there, and this lighter mountaineers from, I don't know, the Lycian hinterland, for example, or just the pirates that were basically the same people, would be able to jump around, climb, sort of harass even the heavier troops, right? So the idea is that the Greeks during the Persian Wars had a higher level, of course, of heaviness, right? And but also there is not much to run around on ship decks. For this reason, you can imagine just how gruesome the Marines' task really was. There were, of course, other national contingents providing with marine troops and wearing some sort of similar hoplitic equipment, such as guys from Cyprus, the same Hellenic, say, allies of the Persians, especially from Asia. Also, other islanders from the Aegean. There are the Lycian pirates as well that are somehow famous, and they are similar, say, to the Lycians, for example, but sort of more, even lighter, right, more Eastern influence. So whenever we get the chance to deal with something more specific and in-depth on these single peoples, right, but it's important to understand sort of the variety of the Achaemenid army force and this world of essentially amphibious naval warfare combined with the interland military traditions that all brought, as we've seen, sort of different elements on the table, even though we are not specifically aware, of course, of the many other details of the fighting styles of the Marines, right? As I said at the beginning, do not separate them too much from what they were on land on a more regular basis, because we're talking fundamentally the same people, right? But I'm glad that from a couple of years we started a series of naval warfare, because it helps understanding a lot the land one as well, right? Once you understand that, of course, these naval operations were meant essentially to support land armies, to just bring the same terrestrial forces to fight in other circumstances, what do you finally appreciate the essence even of much what land warfare could, and the flexibility of the same, right? And so this I think is relevant, and that's why I think that these videos are important to make. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.